My name is John Borelli, and I work in the Office of the President here at Georgetown University. Well, this morning we had a very lively panel and continuing conversations in our intensive dialogue on realizing the common good. And we can expect every bit as engaging and enjoyable a panel this afternoon with the fine panelists that we have gathered for you for this program on faith, culture, and the common good. I will introduce our panelists, beginning with the first one on your right, poet Robert Pinsky, who's a professor of English and creative writing at Boston University. He is the author of 19 books, and most recently his selected poems in 2011 and his anthology, Singing School, Learning to Write and Read Poetry by Studying with the Masters, 2013. His translation, The Inferno of Dante, 1994, received the Los Angeles Times Book Award in Poetry. His volume of poetry, The Figured Wheel, New and Collected Poems, 1966 to 1996, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist and received the Lenore Marshall Award and the Ambassador Book Award. As Poet Laureate of the United States from 1997 to 2000, Robert Pinsky founded the Favorite Poem Project, in which thousands of Americans of varying backgrounds, all ages, and from every state shared their favorite poems. He has been awarded the Italian Premio Capri and the Korean Manhei Award. Perhaps in this conference, it is important to name three of his prose volumes: Democracy, Culture, and the Voice of Poetry, 2002, The Sounds of Poetry, 1998, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Poetry and the World, 1988. Seated next to Robert Pinsky is Alice McDermott. Our hardworking policy experts are going to be jealous that you're clapping with the name of each of these persons. It shows you the fervor with which they come to hear you this afternoon. Alice McDermott is the author of novels A Bigamous Daughter, 1988, That Night, 1987, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the PEN/Faulkner Award. And At Weddings and Wakes, 1992, a New York Times bestseller and Pulitzer Prize finalist. She also authored Charming Billy, 1998, which won the National Book Award, the American Book Award, and was shortlisted for the international, for the Impact Dublin Literary Award. She also authored Child of My Heart, 2002, which was also nominated for the Impact Dublin Literary Award. And After This, 2006, a Pulitzer Prize finalist. She is the Richard A. Maxey Professor for Distinguished Teaching in the Humanities at Johns Hopkins University. Her seventh novel, Someone, was published to acclaim in September 2013, and she was our guest here at Georgetown in our Faith and Culture series earlier in the year. Her articles, reviews, and stories have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, the Atlantic Monthly, the New Yorker, Red Book, Ms., Commonweal, and can you believe elsewhere. She is the recipient of the Whiting Writers Award and the 2008 Corrington Award for Literature. Alan Lightman is a novelist, essayist, physicist, and educator. Currently, he is professor of the practice of the humanities at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was also the John Burkhardt Professor of the Humanities at MIT until 2003. As an accomplished scientist and author, Lightman bridges the sciences and the humanities through his exploration of the intersection between science, human experience, and faith in his writing. He has also published many essays in news, science and literary publications. Lightman has written several novels, including The Diagnosis, 2000, a finalist for the 2000 National Book Award in Fiction, and a selection of Book Sense 76. Reunion, 2003, a selection of Book Sense 76 and a finalist for the Massachusetts Book Award. Ghost, 2007, and Mr. G, 2012, a novel about the creation as told by God. The Accidental Universe, The World You Thought You Knew, 2014, explores the philosophical, moral, theological implications of new findings in science. His novel, Einstein's Dream, 1993, was a runner-up for the 1994 Penn New England Boston Globe Winship Award, and the March 1998 selection for the National Public Radio's Talk of the Town Book Club. A native of Memphis, Tennessee, Lightman earned his BA in physics from Princeton University and a PhD in theoretical physics from the California Institute of Technology. In 2003, Lightman founded the Harpswell Foundation, which seeks to empower future women leaders in Cambodia and elsewhere. Our fourth author is Ayanna Mathis. Who is originally from Philadelphia. She is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and a recipient of the Michener Copernicus Fellowship. The 12 Tribes of Hattie, 2012, her first novel, was a New York Times bestseller, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, an NPR Best Book of the Year, and a selection for Oprah Winfrey's Book Club 2.0, an interactive multi-platform reading club. She taught fiction writing as a visiting faculty member at the Iowa Writers Workshop and is currently teaching at the Writers Foundry, the MFA program at St. Joseph College, Brooklyn, where she lives. She contributed to the New Yorker's memorial coverage of Nelson Mandela, and her nonfiction has appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Atlantic. And finally, another writer, our own Paul Ely. Who is a senior fellow with the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs and director of the American Pilgrimage Project, a university partnership with StoryCorps based in the Berkeley Center. He is the author of 2 books, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, An American Pilgrimage, 2003, and Reinventing Bach, 2012, and of essays and articles for The Atlantic, The New York Times, Commonweal, and other periodicals. With the American Pilgrimage Project, he is examining the ways religious beliefs inform the experience of the American people at crucial moments in their lives. He also moderates the university's Faith and Culture Conversation Series, which has welcomed Marilyn Robinson, James Wood, Taylor Branch, Ron Hansen, Richard Rodriguez, and Alice McDermott here to the Hilltop. He posts pieces daily to a Georgetown website called everythingthatrises.com. I'm turning this over now to Paul Ely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you to President DeGioia, Cardinal Ravasi, Cardinal Wuerl, and thank you also to my parents who are present here today. I'm glad that you're with us. Here today, we're going to pick up a conversation that has gone on in this room for a little over 50 years, at least. 50 years ago, Flannery O'Connor read and spoke about her work in this room, 1963. And her voice will be heard again tonight when her great short story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, will be given a dramatic presentation at Lorfink Auditorium on campus. Well, when O'Connor went to colleges to give talks, one of the points she made is that the church is not a culture. And I remember being mystified when I read that. And over time, I understood that the church is not a culture. The church takes root in particular cultures, and that's how we understand the interaction of church and culture. In O'Connor's case, it was the culture of what she called the Christ-haunted South. In the instance we're talking about today, it's the culture of North America, which is substantially shaped by the continent of Europe, a distinct culture of its own, one that owes something to that of Europe, but is distinctive and not least distinctive in religious ways. The last time I was on that continent, Europe, I saw in a bookstore in Trastevere Robert Pinsky's early book, An Explanation of America. And that title looks, it has a different effect when you see it on the shelf in a bookstore in Rome than it would in a bookstore in Cambridge. Well, the explanation of America, any adequate explanation of America, has to do justice to the stubborn religiosity of this country. We're religiously varied, we're religiously complicated, religiously vexed at times, but the presence of religion in North America is a fact and one that we continue to try to understand. It's my experience that one way to understand it, one place to find some of the best accounts of how religion figures into the American experience is in literature, in poems, in stories, in novels, in distinguished nonfiction. And that the variety of accounts of religious experience that we find there can enrich our understanding of what it is we talk about when we talk about something like faith, culture, and the common good. So we're lucky to have here 4 artists who, in their different ways, have found religion has found expression in different ways in their work. Religious heritage, religious upbringing, religious preoccupations in the present, religious convictions, ideas about the seculum that are formed with the religious context in mind, a look at the future that Flannery O'Connor called the realism of distances, a mode that she considered something akin to prophecy. So I hope to put a little flesh on the bones of those ideas in the next few minutes by talking to these 4 writers who have more and better things to say than I do. I'm going to begin with a story that comes from the time when I worked in publishing. I had the privilege of working with Robert Pinsky, and our work together began with his translation of the Inferno of Dante. And I remember you describing how there were ink stains on your pillow from your attempt to get one last tercet right at night before going to sleep. So there we were working on Dante, and Dante brought together classical culture and Christian culture, religious ideas and things of the world better than any artist ever has, really. And so in the context of our work on Dante, Robert introduced me to a contemporary writer who brought together those things in an unmatched way. And I'm thinking of the Lithuanian poet Czesław Miłosz, who went to Paris and then to Berkeley, California. Now, I'd heard Miłosz read from his cat poems at the National Arts Club. And to hear Miłosz, who was in his 80s, read these playful cat poems, it's like watching Roger Federer play badminton. Yeah. But then from you, I got the full encounter with the strong Miłosz through a poem, Incantation, which you helped him translate. Could we start things off with your, how do you say, reading or speaking of Incantation? An incantatory delivery of Incantation?
There's no question that Czesław chose the title Incantation quite advisedly. The poem can seem almost corny. In his essays, Seamus Heaney talks about my reading this to him in my house one day, and Seamus saying, I hope this isn't offensive to anyone here, Seamus saying, on the one hand, it seemed like a great poem. On the other hand, it seemed like it might have been written by some father at the parish up in the next neighborhood. And I think the title places what might seem a naive optimism about the poem, places it in the category of prayers and charms and spells. It's an incantation. As I've heard Czesław say, It's the world not as it is, but as we're trying to bring it into being. Incantation from the Polish of Czesław Miłosz. Human reason is beautiful and invincible. No bars, no barbed wire, no pulping of books, no sentence of banishment can prevail against it. It establishes the universal ideas in language and guides our hand, so we write truth and justice with capital letters, lie and oppression with small. It puts what should be above things as they are. It is an enemy of despair and a friend of hope. It does not know Jew from Greek or slave from master, giving us the estate of the world to manage. It saves austere and transparent phrases from the filthy discord of tortured words. It says that everything is new under the sun, opens the congealed fist of the past. Beautiful and very young are philosophia and poetry, her ally in the service of the good. As late as yesterday, nature celebrated their birth. The news was brought to the mountains by a unicorn and an echo. Their friendship will be glorious. Their time has no limit. Their enemies have delivered themselves to destruction. I could comment in relation to Dante.
Please.
I practice no religion, and I was raised in a nominally Orthodox Jewish household, and I was permanently imprinted with ideas that are current on this campus when I started reading the Renaissance poetry, which is in English, which is loaded with the Thomist or Augustinian ideas, including the idea that evil is a lack or a defect. And Czesław's poem, I think, has that intellectual background in that he's talking about being. And in, I think it's Canto 9, Dante says, why do we wound ourselves? Why do we choose to suffer? As I understand that idea, the sin or evil, it's an absence of energy. As dark is an absence of light energy, cold is an absence of heat energy. And it's as though the soul bites or tears at itself and makes itself less. I'm told there's a saying in the Talmud, which I have not studied, that says, the injuries that others do to us are as nothing compared to the injuries that we do to ourselves. And the astonishing thing about that is that, to me, is that it actually is true. And it's amazing, but all of the time that was not fair, or that teacher was mean to me, or that book review wasn't fair, or whatever, one has done worse things to oneself. And in my understanding of Dante, the Inferno, it's quite consistent with Czesław's incantation. Dante has given himself the most fatal of all wounds, want hope or despair, which in our jargon we call depression. And it is the worst sin because if you're in it, you can't, grace isn't extended to you. You can't believe that it's extended to you, though it may be. And I consider Inferno the most profound book ever written about depression. And Incantation by Czesław, who approved of that version of it, to me is an incantation against despair. And despair is indeed implicit in every line of the poem. I'm told that the keynote had to do with our American democracy potentially despairing, increasing rigidity, loss of social mobility, and increasingly large gap between social classes, that the difference between the rich and the poor has been exacerbated, and that's a cause for despair, potentially, and it is another socially self-inflicted wound that is, like all these self-inflicted wounds, somewhat mysterious. Why did we do that to ourselves, since it hurts?
So the poem as presented in books, I'm not sure if it's true in your selected, has at the bottom the colophon Berkeley 1968. And this is a two-part response here. So in some respects, Miloš is writing at or around a country that seemed to be coming apart. Czech Republic, France, Berkeley. In another sense, and this is the sense in which you introduced the poem to me, there was a very strong run of poetry in those years that was very inward and confessional and ended in a number of instances in suicide, in the case of Sylvia Plath, in the case of Anne Sexton, in the case of John Berryman. And as you presented it to me, at least, this example of Miloš was of a public poetry that looked to the resources of the larger society and faced language out toward society rather than in a way that might be self-wounding in the way that you suggest. Is that?
Yes, but here the personal is implicit, and I think the greatest poetry, as in the Commedia, you cannot easily separate the personal from the civic. A lot of people point to Easter 1916 as the greatest political or civic poem. It begins personally and with an account of social class. He says, I've seen them coming from counter or desk. And I was making jokes about them around the fire at the club. They were coming from counter or desk, shopkeeper or clerk.
Workers.
And
yeah.
one of them he had thought a drunken, vainglorious lout. Totally personal, little grudge. I thought him a drunken, vainglorious lout. And I joked about him and his colleagues who did this terrible beauty, as he calls it. So for me, Czesław's, a lot of his greatest poems are poems that move very fluidly and rapidly from his own experience, quite personal experience, his love affairs, his sadnesses, his personal vanities and victories, and the fate of Europe, the Holocaust, the invasion of Poland, Nazism, the Iron Curtain. Those are all there, and they tend to be there in poems that are also quite personal. So in a way, in our conversation, whatever year that was, Paul, maybe the bifurcation was too great.
Possibly so, and that was right when you were moving into a more public mode as poet laureate. Maybe that I'm just not fully remembering it, but in thinking about it in preparation for this event, the way the courtyard of the Gentiles has been characterized is a free space where people of different beliefs and of no formal belief at all come together, and there are disquisitions there. But the courtyard is outside the temple. The temple is present, and reference is made to the existence of the temple. And that's, in a way, I'm trying to draw a line between what you've characterized as the public space of poetry, as a kind of agora or a market square with a house of worship on one side, and this courtyard of the Gentiles that we're carrying through a series of conversations with the Vatican. Do you have a sense of a public space where poetry exists, and does the temple belong there?
The temple for me, God and the temple for me, is an interesting and essential episode in the history of creation. For a truly devout person, creation is an episode in the career of God. So the temple for me, if I were in the street and giving directions, I'd say, yeah, the temple's in the courtyard. And that would be a geographical and a sort of ideological or intellectual location. I have spent many hours as a child in the synagogue, and it was one of the great reliefs of my life is that I don't have to. But you Catholics can appreciate this. The Musaf on Saturday morning takes over 3 hours. So I'm of those who find the courtyard more interesting than the synagogue. But the synagogue is in it.
But I seem to remember you liked watching the pretty young women go in and out of the church across the street.
Across the street, Our Lady Star of the Sea. There are Catholic girls going and coming. It was a resort town. And there we were doing 3.5 hours.
So Alice, so here we have this conception of the courtyard, free space, belief, beliefs of different kinds and no form of belief are contending there, but the temple is present. Now, we've had so many conversations, I'm still trying to figure out how it is you do what you do. And what you do in terms of, in the vocabulary that we're using today, is you've created a body of work in which there's a very strong presence of the Catholicism of your protagonists and of the world they live in without the furniture of Catholicism being that prominent. There aren't that many churchy scenes and so forth relative to how Catholic your work is usually seen as. Do you consciously think about having that be a presence in your work, and do you think about the fact that it's not such a presence today? Is that something you think about at all, or?
I suppose I think about it because I'm asked about it so much. I have to
Here we go again.
Hurry up and think about it. Right. I think that when I started out writing fiction with a focus on Catholic characters, it seemed to me that was just a way to give a vocabulary to the characters for things that were common. The unspoken things, the aspirations, the longings, the sense of wonder at the world and confusion at the world, the harm that we do to ourselves and the harm that's visited upon us. How can characters even think about that, nevertheless speak about it, without some kind of metaphorical language? And the church gave these particular characters language with which to speak about that. But I never thought about Catholicism as my subject. I always felt my subject were those things that Catholicism gave my characters language for. And I think this comes back to that whole sense of what's common, the things that perhaps we take too much for granted that are common to us all. I've noticed on my last book tour this fall, the good news is I noticed that when I'm asked, and you're still a practicing Catholic, and I say yes, the discomfort level of my interview is not as great as it used to be. I think this is Pope Francis, thank you very much. I don't get,
Helping authors worldwide.
Yes, exactly. I can say, yes, I still practice, I know, without the conversation sort of ending because they're thinking this woman's an idiot. But on the other hand, the other thing I've noticed is that when I talk about commonalities, the things that I thought I learned from literature early on and that we all go to literature for, that recognition of, despite what the story is about, the story speaks to things that we all understand and, as I say, aspire to or are confused by. And I'm finding more and more when I say that, that's when I get the, oh, you're deluded reaction. Really that sense of, and do you believe that there are common things among human beings? I actually had one interviewer say to me when I said, I'm not really writing about Catholics, I'm just looking for what can the story say that's true of us all? And the interviewer sort of sat back with gotcha look on her face. And she said, and you do think that there are things that are true of us all? And I said, well, yes. And she sat back further and said, what about psychopaths? And I said, oh, sorry, I forgot the psychopath. But just that sense that, maybe it's this whole question of common good. As we were saying just before we came in, maybe common is one thing, but maybe we can't even be sure that there's good. That sense that literature brings us to an understanding through incantation of something that we all intuit as true and just don't always have the metaphor or the words for. And more and more I'm finding that's where the blowback comes, that how can you be so sure that there's anything that's common to any one of us?
Well, that's what I feel in the fiction, that when I say that there's the Catholic furniture isn't so prominent in your work. It's that what these people believe feels like something held in common rather than an address or the name of a church or the color of stained glass or certain sacramental practices. And I'm so taken with that I think of this as your giant step as a writer, and that you have moved it away from furniture and toward things held in common, and it's very powerful. And the way your work is received suggests that that's the case, that your books are often set in the past, but you're not seen as a historical novelist. You're seen as a stylish contemporary writer, and the books are published and received that way. So on some level, that you have readers is pretty strong evidence that there are things held in common. And so your account of your work is satisfying and gives hope, I suppose. I wonder if when you were here a few months ago, you spoke about not really choosing this as your material, and that's it's really true. These characters keep saying, "Tell my story."
Yeah. Maybe I should travel more and laugh more. Yeah, as I say, for me, it is that attempt to say something that seems true, and often it's material at hand. Often it's what I can use because I know the furniture and I know the language. But I'm not interested in the furniture and the language. I'm interested in what the language provides to the characters. That sense that not only that characters have a common metaphor or the common faith, but also that they are continually unsure of it. And that's what becomes interesting to me. And if I don't have the thing that they all apparently agree on, then I can't dramatize or get at anything that strikes me as interesting about their faith if I can't do the variations away from it, if I can't improvise off the baseline of what they agree on and what they understand. Then I can't get to the yes but of belief.
Can't get to the psychopaths.
I can't get to the poor psychopaths, yes, who I've been neglecting terribly.
So Robert and Alice, I've spent lots of time with you. Alan and Ayanna, I just met you this morning, but that's not the way I feel because I've read your books, and that's something of what literature can do in a special way. This book that's written by a person alone in a room is read by a person often alone in a room, and the sense of fairly direct communication is very powerful. So when I saw you, Alan, in the hall outside, it was with recognition, not a sense of a first meeting. So we leapt right ahead to this question of how is art true? And this follows on what you were saying about the testing of your work and what feels true in it, Alice. Because, Alan, I approach you knowing that you're a scientist, so impressed with the rigor of your standards of verification. In your book, your most recent book, The Accidental Universe, you make clear that as a scientist, what's most true is and correct me if I'm wrong, this core belief of science that there are natural laws that obtain in all times and places with no violation. And it's those truths that scientists set out to find and elucidate and clarify. So then the question arises, how is art true? And I'm asking because you've set the bar for truth so high in the scientific side of your writing that you're pretty tough on art. And so most of us are just pretty sentimental about art being true. We like it, and so we consider it true. What are the truths of art from the point of view of someone who has a scientific background of the kind that you have?
Well, I think that the truths of art lie in the personal domain and the emotional and psychological condition of individual human beings. And one of the reasons that I personally know that there are truths in art is if I read a novel, it's very easy for me to tell whether a character rings true. or not. And we've all read novels that are quote, plot-driven, and the characters serve only to move the plot forward, and probably the novelist decided what his or her plot was even before writing the book. And those characters differ very much from characters that grow organically, characters whose reactions even the novelist doesn't know ahead of time, characters that have the complexity of real people. And we're able to know immediately whether the character rings true, and when I say rings true, I mean accords with our experience of the world, our personal experience of the world. And that is an internal truth. And I think for me, that's the power of the arts. It's a different kind of truth than the truth in science. It's not verifiable in the same way. I can make a statement in science about how long it takes for a ball to hit the floor when dropped from a height, and I can go measure that. How long does it take a ball to hit the floor if you drop it from 6 feet? That's a very well-posed question. People all over the earth can test that. I can say it's 1.8 seconds or whatever the number is. That can be verified by people all over the world. They verify it with instruments that are outside of their bodies, with rulers and stopwatches. I think that the kinds of truth that occur in the arts and humanities are verifiable by looking inward. They're personal confirmations. And I think that distinguishes the arts from the sciences. It's a very powerful kind of verification. When you read a book of fiction that's written well, you have a very different experience than reading a book of nonfiction. You are drawn into a magical world that has contact with your own personal world. You identify with the characters. You gain insights into the human condition. You gain insights about your own self. And that's a very powerful experience that the arts bring. I think a scientist can have an emotional relationship with the laws of science, but in the end, it's not a personal relationship, because I think the essence of science is the equation that can be re-derived by any graduate student, or the experiment that can be duplicated anywhere. Whereas I think that the intense emotional experience that comes from giving yourself over to an artistic experience, or I'll even use the word the transcendent experience, which relates, of course, to religious belief, that is inherently personal. So that's what I feel about the difference in the kinds of truths and the truth in art.
You were explaining it from the point of view of what happens to the reader. And of course, you're a writer, but you're a reader. And the four of you as writers are readers. And when I read Ayanna Mathis' novel, I had this sense of characters that rang true. And then I found in reading an interview with you that's not just an effect you're hoping to achieve in the reader, that's what leads you further on in the writing of the novel in the first place. That you spoke of following character, and a character, is that connected with the truth of the character, a character that can be that's truthful enough to follow or real enough to follow?
I think so, certainly. I mean, I never have that experience. Sometimes people sort of talk about how their characters become so real to them, and they're in the shower, and then there's the characters, like, and they're sort of passing the soap back and forth and talking at the breakfast table, and, this kind of thing. And I wish that would happen, because it seems like maybe it would be a little easier somehow, but I don't. We're really just kind of in there duking it out. But certainly, in order for me to sort of follow a character wherever he or she is going to go, there has to be something. There has to be something in that character that rings of truth, and that rings, I think, more particularly for me. And I wonder if in some ways they're sort of the same thing in my conception of it, that rings of something beautiful. And when I say beauty, I don't mean in the sort of purely ornamental sense. I was at an interview, and someone asked me about aesthetics, and they said, it was sort of essentially saying to me, what do you think good writing is? And I said, and they were asking about the aesthetics of writing, and I said, well, I think years ago I thought it had to do with pretty sentences, which of course it does. I mean, sentences are sort of what we're working with. But as I sort of wrote more, and as I kind of peel it back and peel it back and peel it back, I realized that what it is that I think is beautiful is the thing itself, not necessarily the words that I use to express them, or that the beauty of the words used to express that come from the beauty of the thing itself.
And the thing itself is a story or a structure?
The thing itself, I think, is actually even beyond that, because I think the story is also expressing the thing itself. The thing itself is some kind of truth or essentially beautiful thing about what it is to be a human being. So the story is in service to that, the sentences are in service to that, the images, all of it, the entire project of writing something is in service to the thing itself. So, which I suppose is also a kind of truth for me, certainly. In some ways I think of it as beauty, but I suppose it is actually both in my estimation.
In the middle of the century, there was a pretty strong kind of rhetoric in Catholic writing that talked about Catholicism as the repository of mystery and the protector of mystery. And I read this in the 70s, and I thought that Catholicism wasn't the least bit mysterious in that era. All the lights were on, all the windows were clear, all the confessions were done in folding chairs, and so forth. So I guess gradually I've wound around to the view that what we still know to be mysterious is art, and that's what I'm hearing in your testimony here. You've described having a bunch of short stories that weren't quite going somewhere, and then suddenly when they became 12 stories of people in a clan, the 12 tribes of Hattie, with that biblical motif as the title, suddenly the title and the imagery and the action cohere in a way that they didn't before. It's mysterious how that happened, isn't it?
Entirely. I mean, I think, I said to my mother is a very wise woman. She's 80, and she's been wise, I think, for a long time. But at any rate, maybe before I came on the scene, but I don't know. At any rate, she's 80, and I was talking to her about this is sort of a personal story, but I was talking to her about my book and it's sort of unexpected reception in the world to me. And so I said, well, what do I do with this? And I'm so confused, and maybe I feel guilty, and blah, 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 blah. And my mother says, well, I don't know that there's any point in that, because we live in the midst of a mystery. And of course we do live in the midst of a mystery. And so this notion, I think, one of the problems, sort of going back to this question of the common good, I think that sometimes one of the sort of divisive things between us, religiously, racially, in terms of class, all of it, is that is that we seem to have this tendency to want to sort of corner the market on the articulation of the mystery. First of all, in articulating that there is one, and then secondly, articulating that we know how it works. But of course, it's sort of futile. Then there's no mystery at all, and it's also futile because, it kind of can't be known that that's the mystery. But it's interesting to me to think about the ways in which the arts in general are often an articulation or an attempt to articulate the mystery.
Reads on the unspeakable is what Hans Merton called one of his books. Alan, you called one of your books A Sense of the Mysterious, isn't that right? And so what's striking about your work, you're a physicist and a novelist and essayist, and with great equanimity you state that you're a spiritual atheist without a sense of loss or defense or challenge. And also in the next sentence, in many instances, state that your sense of the mysterious is very powerful and indelible, and that these two things have to go together because there's ample evidence that they do. Can you, if I got you right?
Yes. Well, one of my favorite quotes from Einstein is that the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. The mysterious lies at the cradle of true art and true science. And I love that quote. I think the mysterious is related to a sense of wonder at the world. And it's not the same as fear. It's not quite the same as awe either. It's sort of amazement at the strange cosmos that we find ourselves in, and trying to find meaning. And we were talking about what do human beings have in common. Okay, I think that the one thing we have in common is we all have a sense of our mortality. Whether we believe in an afterlife or not, there's some kind of mortality with this body. And I think that we're all trying, either consciously or unconsciously, to find meaning, both cosmic meaning and personal meaning. And I think those are things that we have in common. And I think this wonder at the world, at this strange cosmos that we find ourselves in, that we were born into. I think that both the sciences and the arts and religion are trying to grapple with this and find meaning in it. And I once interviewed, I did an interview with about 30 cosmologists, professional cosmologists, who all work on understanding the origin and evolution of the universe. These are all professional scientists. And one of the scientists said to me, Martin Schmidt from Caltech, that when he is most excited about the scientific enterprise when there is we discover a big problem and we don't know the answer to it.
Robert, you said somewhere that we're going to go to the microphone in a minute for questions. And I was tempted to put the two of you, Alice and Robert, in the same category, setting you against Alan here, because your work, you spoke about finding meaning, Alan. I mean, that's beautifully said about the differences between awe and wonder and mystery. And then there's a sense of the need to find meaning. When my sense in the Catholic tradition, but also, let's say, reading Robert's work or Alice's work, that there's a superabundance of meaning that needs to be ordered. I remember hearing Robert read aloud a poem on the radio that was made out of a list, isn't that right? Yeah. And it was just, watch how meaningful this is. It was like a magic trick that you did. Alice, whatever your characters lack, a sense of the significance of life is not one of their lacks, isn't that right? that took their bedrock sense that this really counts. Am I holding you too strictly to this idea of finding meaning, Alan? That a kind of positivist view of that you need to find meaning out there. See the difference? I come from the experience where there's so much meaning, you just try to figure out how to make some sense of it all.
If everything has meaning, then nothing has meaning. I mean, you have to decide on how to live, and you can't maximize everything.
I think Alice's interviewer provides us with a perfect example of how a mystery is a meaning that suggests other meanings, a meaning that isn't complete yet, a meaning is inspiring other things. As it happens, I recently read about a psychopath. Andrew Solomon writes a wonderful essay in which he interviews the father of the young man who killed 26 small children in a primary school, and then he had killed his mother and he killed himself. The father of this man decided a year later, in his agony, to talk to Andrew Solomon about this. I found myself feeling immense amounts in common, not only with the father, all the mysteries. At one point, Solomon, I think a wonderful sentence, says, every parent deals with the day and the year. Today, should you make an argument about eating the vegetables? Long term, you have to learn to eat vegetables. In this case, this extremely disturbed, limited young man got into a folie à deux with his mother, where his demands got worse and worse and worse. And instead of trying to get some global view of them or the therapist, she started complying with them. That ended in this about as horrible a thing as you can imagine, as the father acknowledges. I've experienced that. And the young man, at one point, asked his father, I think when he was pretty young, 11 or 12 years old, why do we want to have friends? Why should a person want to have friends? And I felt very sad, and I felt, yes, I sometimes question my own hunger for other people, my need of other people. And what is it? And sometimes I'll find to my astonishment, not everybody likes me. Ooh, how could that be? And I would say to that interviewer, you're damn right we have things in common with psychopaths. No question in the world about that. I suppose, awkwardly enough, I'm espousing a Christian principle here.
We'll forgive you.
I hope you heard us say, we'll forgive you.
Alice?
Well, actually, you're saying that, and I did read that article and felt much the same as a parent, any parent, the agony, both sides of the father and of the child, too.
The trapped mother.
And yes, yeah, and that doing the best we can with a situation that's beyond our control. Mm-hmm. And I do remember actually saying to that interviewer that if a writer like Nabokov can make me identify with Humbert and feel a modicum of sympathy for him at the end of the novel, when, since he's thrown away all morality, he's driving through one red light after the other, and he describes the color of the red light as something that reminds him of the taste of claret on his tongue when he was 9 years old. And his boyhood and his entire life becomes part of that image. And I can't help but sympathize. This is this horrible person who I should be able to distance myself from because of the language, because of the incantation of using the right words and the right images. I'm struck with not sympathy, but fellow feeling. This I am Humbert. That's the experience of literature.
Now we're really talking about the mystery of art. First of all, this character exists, words on a page exists, then you care about him, then that you identify with him, then you feel fellow feeling, then you are Humbert Humbert. Now that's transcendence. Ayana?
I was, as you were talking, and I was thinking a lot about, Robert sort of talked about despair, and he was talking about Dante. And I was thinking about this process of a kind of, what could you say, a kind of radical empathy that happens, when we sort of experience literature and we begin to sort of identify with characters and the spirits of the characters and the ideas that we find there. And I think very much that is sort of acts against despair. I think about something like Faulkner's Sound and the Fury, right? This is not a happy novel. And however, it is not a despairing novel. The people in it are living often in a condition of despair, but the novel itself is not despairing. And I think that the reason that the novel itself is not despairing is because, of course, of the sort of wild, sort of galloping horses of the language, which is its own kind of life and joy in a certain sort of way. So there's that. But there's also the fact that the writing, that the novel, it sort of breaks down the membrane between you and the characters. That is its project, to destroy the membrane between you and the characters. It happens also in Absalom, Absalom. And so that you sort of have this experience of leaving the confines of your own experience, which is kind of a drag. Aren't you ever sort of like, I'm so sick of being me, I'm me again. But at any rate, so you sort of leave your me-ness and you enter into this otherness, which seems to me to be a profound, and I'll use the word, sort of sacred experience of communion, which seems to me to be also a kind of anti-despair. And that's also, I think, what literature does, is sort of anti-despair.
Literature on the side of life against death in some basic sense. I neglected to say, come to the microphone to pose a question. Are there questions? Yes. That was really something.
Thank you. This is a wonderful panel, and it's hard to choose. But Alan, we were classmates at Princeton. I'm also from Tennessee. And I just wanted to push back ever so slightly about your definition of science, because you used the term laws. And I sometimes feel that creates confusion. To me, science is inherently an acknowledgement of how little we know and a wish to know more, with the assumption that every new theory is provisional. And just to give a fascinating example that should have come from a novelist, not a scientist, did I read correctly that it is plausible that the universe is a computer simulation? Could you explain that?
Well, I think that was a metaphorical statement. I don't think there are many scientists who really believe that the universe is a computer simulation. I know what you're referring to. But in terms of the laws, that you said that science is an ongoing provisional activity, and that is certainly true. But I think that scientists do believe that nature is a rational, orderly system, and that there are laws that we're in the process of discovering, and you can think of science as a project of greater and greater, of finding better and better approximations to those ultimate laws. And you can easily measure the progress of science because we're able to make better and better predictions about the outcomes of new experiments that we've never done before.
Hi, my name is Alberto La Rotunda. I'm a social entrepreneur, and I have a question for the panel, all of you. I was curious, in terms of popular culture, where do you see is the role of emphasizing more literary work and perhaps theatrical work or film that is related to belief and faith? Do you feel that there should be more emphasis on these types of programs that will bring people in from the diverse communities to these types of issues?
I think it's sort of like Alice was saying. She's not sort of interested necessarily in the furniture, of Catholicism, or rather, that's not the primary project of of the work, but it's sort of an ability to sort of enter into a certain kind of asking of questions and answering of questions that vocabulary facilitates, if I've understood correctly. And it seems to me that all of the good books that I know, and all of the sort of good, all the good films that I know, have as whatever their preoccupations are, whether they're religious preoccupations, whatever they are, they have as their first priority, in the case of literature, I think character. They have as their first priority in the case of film something else, the story that's being told, whatever it is. And those, I think, are the things that draw people in. What they can recognize. And so whatever is sort of, whatever is underlying those things, whatever vocabulary is underlying them in Catholicism, or in my case, my sort of childhood Pentecostalism, sort of various things like that. Those things inform, but they are not sort of at the forefront, and therefore people can access them. And I think that what continues to draw people in is the stories, the characters, whatever they are themselves, and then those things facilitate or open the door to different kinds of conversations, kind of like the one that we're having today.
I would like to decline to go along with the word should in the question. I think that American culture, high and low, its glory has been nothing remotely resembling a church of official religion or a Soviet system. If I think about Buster Keaton or Duke Ellington or any of the great popular literature and music, it comes out of an individual cussedness and a sense of people's appetites. And I'm in favor of that individual cussedness and appetite. And I resist the idea that we should promulgate this or should promulgate that. I hope it doesn't fall into the hands of Amazon or Google or anybody else to say what popular culture should do. I hope there continues to be sort of geniuses like Buster Keaton and Duke Ellington who just decide to do something because they think other people would enjoy it the way they do.
And there's also that sense of facing the mystery. I think as soon as we're out to prove something, scientist and artist alike, if we start out wanting to prove something, we're starting out at the wrong end. We start out simply facing the mystery, and then let the science or the art guide us to what is to be discovered. So if we did have more of popular culture bringing us towards religion, it would probably have just the opposite effect, because it would be all really lousy movies and books, and not acknowledging that sort of hold your breath and walk into the darkness and see what happens.
I'll suggest the other tricky term, almost as tricky as mystery, freedom.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Amar Hussain. I just graduated from Georgetown. And going back to one of the themes of the conference being interfaith or intercultural dialogue, do you all have any advice for people like me, like people who are young, just out of college, on how we can use the arts to kind of promote this dialogue?
Just read books from other cultures. My favorite contemporary novel is called A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry, and it's a story of a number of characters in India during the emergency, and I know more from that novel than I could know from a lot of textbooks or seminars or old episodes of documentary television. It was an intercultural experience just reading the book.
I think we have, sort of extraordinarily profound experiences of mystery and from all kinds. I was listening this morning. I've been listening to a lot of very old blues lately, and I was listening this morning to Maddie Delaney, who didn't record very much, and she has a song called Tallahatchie River Blues, and there's a line in the song, and she says, "High water rising, gonna have to pack my bag and go back to Tennessee. High water rising, that old Tallahatchie River done got the best of me. oh, there's some poetry for you. Because there's no agenda, there's no, but we can access it and we can feel it, and there's something, so I think just taking in, reading as much as you can, listening to music, all of these things, you sort of take in, and they inspire and they birth all kinds of conversations, of communication, of all that kind of stuff.
One more question, and then we'll take the other questions to the 2 tents of dialogue.
Hi, my name is Christopher Hale. I'm with Catholics in Alliance here in D.C. Father Adolfo Nicolas, who heads the Jesuits worldwide, had this famous speech in 2010 where he said there's the globalization of superficiality, and he was talking about universities fighting against that. It sounds like what Francis is saying with the globalization of indifference. But he said, he critiqued the arts. He said, we're seeing a superficialization of the arts and literature. And Francis said the same thing in 2010 in his famous book-length interview of Heaven and Earth. And they both said that religion could be a source to reinvigorate the arts. Now, my 2 questions are, do you accept the critique that there has been a superficialization of the arts, and can religion help, if you will, embody it more, give it more spirit to it?
No and no.
Ditto.
I think the complaint that the arts are superficial and trivial is an old one. Certainly before my time, I have heard echoes of it. And I think probably what Rawls said, any art that seeks to promote, first and foremost, is headed down the wrong path. I don't think I would be a practicing Catholic now if I hadn't discovered what goes on within the pages of a book or the lines of a poem. I was happy, as many of my generation were, to kiss it all goodbye. 12 years of Catholic school, I got it. I don't need any more of it. Literature is where my salvation lies. That's where the important stuff is going on. And the more I read and the more I studied and the more I understood my own response, and I think the world's response to the great works and what a sentence can do, and the mystery of the effect of fine art, I understood that what my church was all about, essentially, all along. And those 2 things, I was able to reconcile all that my despair over the triviality of what I saw coming from the Catholic Church, and recognize that at heart it is speaking of the same things that all our artists and our scientists are seeking. And I think if it had been the other way around, if I had gone to literature to try to reaffirm my faith, it wouldn't have happened.
I'll yield to the temptation to make a kind of commercial announcement. If you're in despair about art and the world is going to hell and people aren't serious anymore, I made these videos at favoritepoem.org. If you go to favoritepoem.org, you'll see a construction worker reading Whitman, discussing Whitman very cogently. You'll see a Cambodian American immigrant in San Jose, a high school student. She relates Langston Hughes's Minstrel Man to her family's horrible experiences in the Pol Pot regime. You'll see a U.S. Marine with an Hispanic surname read Yeats's Politics. And in a way, to the recent graduate who said, what can you do about dialogue? One thing would be listening, not assuming that people are yahoos or dopes, and being willing to consider various. So as I will point to the favoritepoem.org as a patriotic gesture about American readers and people, and also as an optimistic, hopeful gesture about the state of the arts.